Hello, hello! Welcome back to Loki's Library, and if you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina. On Sundays, I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. Last month, we looked at some cowboys, so this month we're looking at the Indian side of history, making this week's book of the week, Empire of the Summer Moon. Quanah Parker and the Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in American history, by S.C. Gwynne. The accompanying cocktail is a summer moon. It is 8 ounces of Blue Moon Belgian white wheat ale, 1 ounce of vodka, 2 ounces of lemonade, and an orange wheel to garnish. So let's do this. When the Spanish first started colonizing the Americas way back in the 16th century, the Comanche were a tiny little tribe who lived in a small section of southern Wyoming. This is a known historical fact, all right? This is recorded from Spanish journals, native history tellings from the Apache and the Cheyenne and other surrounding tribes all say the Comanche were nothing. They started this tiny little tribe in southern Wyoming. That is where they got their start. I'm off to a grand start this morning. So that's known, detailed records of what was going on in the Americas. We know this from Spain, from oral histories of other tribes. Now, at some point after landing in southwestern United States, some Spanish colonists lost control of a couple of their horses. And the Spanish ponies were very adaptable and suited to this new land, and they found themselves in and rapidly becoming an invasive species, moving up across the Great Plains and canyons of the American West, where initially the Apache, who had contact with the Spanish and learned from the Spanish how to ride and care for ponies and animal husbandry about the ponies, adapted this new technology for travel. Right, and Gwynne is very specific here. They adapted the technology for travel, and as meat animals, they would eat the horses, but they didn't actually fight from horseback, which is important to the rise of the Comanche, because the Comanche did. With any technology, right, once it's out of the bag, the original traders have no control over it and what happens to it. And the ponies kept spreading north until sometime in the 17th century, early mid-17th century, so that's the 1600s for those of you who don't know time, horse met Comanche. And what was initially a small tribe barely subsisting on hunting rats and other varmints rose to become the single greatest military power on the North American continent. Like bar none, all right? For 200 years, they reigned absolutely supreme within their sphere of influence, which was a pretty big sphere. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. See, the Apache, as I said, learned to ride, and they would eat them, but they didn't fight from horseback. The Comanche absolutely did. The Comanche were like Genghis Khan and the Scythians rolled into one terrifying juggernaut of horseback archery, riding. I said last month in my book on the Rangers, they were seen very comparably to centaurs, half man, half horse, right? They rode that naturally with their ponies. They rolled down the plains from southern Wyoming all the way to northern New Mexico. So this huge swath of the American continent, basically all of the Louisiana Purchase west to Arizona, became part of the Comancheria. And we're talking an area that was 200 million acres became the Comancheria. They claimed it all as theirs, but just by right of conquest, which is what literally every peoples have done, going all the way back to, I don't know, whenever, Australopithecus first met with the Denisovans or whatever fucking, analogy you want to go for. This is the history of humanity. Conquest by, ownership by right of conquest is the history of humanity across the globe. All right, this is provably true by any historical metric you wish to go with. I'm going to shake this up really quick. So the Comanche were that's the overarching tribe name, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. They made lasting treaties with the Kiowa. They were friends with the Kiowa, but every other tribe basically hated and feared the Comanche. Because with the addition of horses, the Comanche personified warrior culture, and it was a brutalist culture. I mean, throw in the Spartans if you like to understand just how brutal this culture was, right? They were built for war. They excelled at war. This was their life. This is what they did. Pour this slowly and let the carbonation die down. But the Comancheria was more or less undisputed. All right, it was very much their land until the 19th century, when America started to spread her wings in James Polk's vision of manifest destiny. But to get to why the 19th century was so violent, Gwynne fully explains that this was not just the American machine rolling over the poor native tribes and stealing their land. This was a war, full on. All right, it was a war for territory, I make no mistakes, it was a war for territory. Land was the prize, but it was a war. And to understand the challenge the Americans faced, you have to understand that the reason Mexico was allowing Americans to immigrate to Texas was to create a buffer zone between the heart of Comancheria and Mexico. All right, it wasn't a stupid thing. It wasn't just a foolish thing to let the white people immigrate. They're like, you can immigrate to this part of the land, and didn't tell them because we need you to absorb the tribes that are going to come down and try and kill you for being in their land. We just need you to distract them so that they stop coming down and killing us. Pretty smart, actually, on the part of Mexico. They just didn't count on Americans being so psychotically and aggressively expansionist, I guess. Because by the time Mexico was allowing this immigration from America to happen, the Spanish, who had ruled Mexico for 300 years at this point, right? The early 16th century, so 1520s to August 24th, 1821, which is when they recognized Mexican independence. They already knew something about the Comanche that America was wildly unprepared for. The extreme military strength of the mounted archers. All right, by this point in history, European culture had gotten away from archery, and they were using guns and gunpowder and then sword combat, right? And this was what was the primary form of combat, as evidenced by the Revolutionary War, War of 1812. All these conflicts all used guns and gunpowder, and then resorted to swords when they absolutely had to. And it's because of these technologies that Spain was easily able to subdue the Mayan, the Incan, and the Aztec empires from Mexico on down into the northern part of South America, right? But the might of Spain, which was easily one of the most competent conquest empires in history, met the Comanches and hit a brick wall. They were unable to advance Spanish territory any higher than modern-day San Antonio, thanks to the skill of the Comanche and their archery from horseback. It is what it is, right? Part of the reason that, and he covers this in the book, but part of the reason that this played out the way it did historically is that farming was developed and known in Europe, Asia, and Africa for about 2,000 years before it hit America. And that 2,000 years of stability, staying in one place, allowed those stable settlements and civilizations in Europe and Asia and Africa to develop things like firearms and advances in technology. Wheels. Sounds silly, but there it is, right? They developed these things, and that gave the Europeans a massive leg up when it came to conquering future territories. Orange wheel in here, and then go from there. Just gonna... By this point in time, by the time, the Spanish hit the Comanche, yes, they had firearms, but they were muzzle-loading rifles. All right, muzzle-loading basically requires you to be dismounted to reload and fire because they're awkward, right? You have to literally, you don't put it, it's not breech loading, you don't break it open and shove the cartridge in like you would think of with a shotgun. You have to put it on the ground, pour the gunpowder down the barrel, ram in a patch, ram in a bullet. It can take anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes to reload, depending on the speed and accuracy of the shooter. Versus the Comanche, who could shoot 20 or more arrows in, half that time. Very fast. While riding at speed on horseback, which adds extra velocity to the arrows. And hit what they aimed at. They were very fierce. So yeah. The Spanish were the other ones who managed to create a lasting treaty with the Comanche. The Kiowa were one. The Apache, and what's really phenomenal about this, and I'll come back to this too later, is that it was the Spanish treaty with the Comanches was with all of the Comanche. And that's a very key point, and we'll come back to that. They created a trading outpost in New Mexico where the Comanche could trade horses and captives, and that became their highway, basically. They would go there when they had excess of either to trade. Now the captive, this is a big part of the story. All right, this is the primary part of the story. Remember the subtitle, Quanah Parker? Well, there's a reason for that. I know there's a lot of romance about how well native tribes treated captives, adopting them into their tribes and making them part of the family. And hell, there's an entire subgenre of romantic fiction of that exact topic, right? The beautiful white woman who is taken hostage only to fall in love with her noble savage captor, and they live happily ever after. Entire genres dedicated to that particular historical fiction. And that fiction largely exists because of Cynthia Ann Parker. Note the last name, right? Quanah Parker. Well, Cynthia Ann was his mother. And when she was 9 years old, she was living with the Parker clan in Texas, the whole extended family having come to Texas from, I believe, was Illinois in 1833 to make their fortunes. And they had purchased up huge acreages of land, like 20,000 acres or something like that. And because it was the frontier, and yes, they were aware of the native tribes and the Comanches, the family had built up a 1-acre palisade in which the whole clan lived. It was called Fort Parker, obviously. But for whatever incompetent reason now lost to history, on the fateful day in question, the palisade was wide open while the men were farming, and the Comanche rode up. Now, 10 of the 16 men were outside, 8 women and 9 children were inside the fort. Maybe the incompetent reason is that James Parker, who had actually been commander of one of the sections of the Texas Rangers, had disbanded his Rangers. He had not had contact with the Comanche for a while. Maybe he thought the threat had passed. Maybe he thought the tribes were cowed or whatever. Rather than what most likely happened is being that the particular band of Comanche that rode through Parker's area of Texas just hadn't gotten to him yet. But, let me try this. It's not bad, but it doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to it either. It's like the beer cancels out the lemonade, so it's just very mellow. I don't want to say bland, but it's mellow. There's not a whole lot of kick to it. I imagine the vodka will kick in a minute. Maybe I should stir this a little bit. It did say gently stir. I forgot to stir. Let's stir it just a little bit, see if we can get the vodka flavoring in there. Now, if the Parkers had all been inside the fort when the Comanche rode up, they could have just closed the doors and everything would have been fine. The palisade walls were thickly built of very good timber. They could have just waited out the Comanche, and the Comanche would have gotten bored and left. Truly, that most likely would have been what happened. And then, they could have ridden for Fort Worth to the larger contingent and said, hey, we have, Indian activity in the area. Let's get some extra help out here. So not what happened, right? It's reported that between 100 and 600 warriors rode up. Most likely it was probably between 100 and 150, with a good portion of that being women. The women rode as well as the men did. All Comanche children were put on horseback as soon as they could walk, basically, which is why there were such outstanding horsewomen, whatever. But they rode up under a white flag. Now, that's interesting, right? Because white flag means truce, and the ever-hopeful Parker clan believed that. They're like, oh, it's a white flag. They must not mean any harm. And the band, and I'm saying band because the Comanche being a very large tribe, and they were, I think at their height they had like 20 or 30,000 individuals, right? They were broken into smaller subgroups called bands. Like, for modern day equivalent, think of the United Kingdom, if you will, right? You have the overarching UK with smaller bands contained therein of English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. So that's very similar to the Comanche, all right? Smaller bands of Cotsatucas, Penatuka, Yamparikas. There were like 5 or 6 major bands with smaller bands within each of those, and at any time a group could break off and form their own band. They would still be acknowledged as Comanche by the larger Comanche tribe. Bands, incidentally, are also why Americans in Texas believe Comanche were breaking treaties and faithless. I mean, it comes down to a fundamental difference in culture. Americans would draw up a treaty and assume that the band the treaty was with spoke for all of the Comanche. Very much not the case. That band was only able to speak for itself. They couldn't speak for all of the Comanche. They could only speak for that band. So when other Comanches would do things like, raid Fort Parker, for example, Americans viewed all Comanche as faithless. I should say Texans viewed all Comanche as faithless at this point in time and would respond in kind. The band, incidentally, would then think the exact same thing when American raids the same way. Rather than thinking maybe this is an outlaw American who is violating the rules and we should, treat him as a criminal, they thought, oh, it's all Americans. And so this fundamental cultural difference led to 50 plus years of warfare. Violent, bloody, awful warfare. Back to the Parker raid. The Comanche told Benjamin Parker, who initially came out to parley with them, that they wanted a cow to slaughter and directions to the nearest watering hole. Parker told them they could not have a cow, but he had other supplies he could give them. Now, the smart family members at this time were bolting out the back of the fort. The not-so-smart were about to experience hell on earth, including James Parker's niece, Rachel Parker Plummer, and her 14-month-old son. I have a typo here. 14, he would have been killed. 14-month-old son, James Pratt Plummer. When Benjamin returned with the supplies for the Comanche, they immediately slaughtered him and raided the fort. Rachel watched her uncle die. Quote, he was clubbed, shot with arrows at extremely close range, and then, probably still alive, scalped. End quote. Rachel herself was quickly caught, knocked unconscious, dragged, beaten, gang raped, and tortured. All of this both immediately and over the next 18 months. She became a slave of one of the Indians that day. I don't remember exactly which tribe. I feel like she was definitely passed from band to band, for a while. In captivity, she would give birth to a daughter as a result of her sexual assaults. It was definitely one of the Comanches' children because she was not pregnant at the time that she was abducted. The Comanche would decide that nursing her daughter was taking her too much time away from her duties of tanning hides and, other work, and would kill her 7-week-old daughter in front of her, because noble savages. Slightly better when you stir it up. Still not a whole lot of there. There's not a lot of burn or kick. I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about this one. This is not a horrifying fiction. Right? This is not something that was written just to titillate people and make, the West think that they were justified. This is what happened. All right. We know this because Rachel would eventually be rescued. And she would tell her story. You can buy her book still on Amazon, detailing her treatment as a captive of the Comanche. More on that in a bit. The Parkers who remained in the fort were killed or captured. Some of those who escaped out the back made it all the way, I believe, to Fort Worth. The ones who were captured were either killed there or taken with the Comanche when they left. The ones who were taken were Elizabeth Kellogg. I don't know what her age was. It wasn't stated in the book, and I couldn't find it online. Cynthia Ann Parker, age 9. John Richard Parker, age 7. Rachel Parker Plummer, who was age 17. And James Pratt Plummer, age 14 months. Now, Kellogg was also tortured, beaten, and raped, but her ordeal was over in a few months. The raid happened on May 19th, 1836. By late May, so not even a month later, she was taken by Kachai Indians, probably in either trade or sold. They were not part of the Comanche tribe, but they did business with the Comanche, so she was sold to the Kachai, who, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. Later, they sold her to Delaware Indians, who then sold her back to her brother-in-law, James W. Parker, in August of 1836. So just over 3 months, she was kept captive. The $150 used to purchase her back was provided courtesy of Sam Houston, who, by all accounts, was actually kind of a decent fellow. Haven't read any biographies on him, but everything I read about him, every time his name pops up in one of these books I've been reading, he seems like a very decent fellow. James Parker, for his part, spent pretty much the rest of his life looking for his missing kin, most especially his daughter Rachel and grandson James. And he was striking out pretty much everywhere. I mean, he chronicled his journeys and apparently makes for very riveting telling. But he didn't have any luck until October of 1837. Now, Rachel spent a little over a year as a slave with Comanche when her captivity was purchased by some white men. These men were not speculators. They were not part of the white slave trade or whatever you want to call it. They were operating under direct orders from a William and Mary Donahoe, who were a wealthy couple in Santa Fe, who had them out basically trolling the Comanche slave trade and said, pay any price you can for white women and we will reimburse you. And so these two white guys had the chance to purchase Rachel, and they did. And Rachel was taken to the Donahoes, and her ordeal more or less ended at that point. I mean, she did have to scarily travel back across the Comanche because she was taken to Santa Fe, but to get back to Missouri, she had to go back across the Comanche, which she did. And she was rescued, all right? She wrote a book about it. So this was 1837 she was rescued. She wrote a book about it, I think it was in 1838, and then she passed away in 1840. A lot of tragedy around this, right? The Parker clan is famous in Texas, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. There's a lot of tragedy with the name Parker in Texas. Now, James Parker's finding of his nephew John and grandson James had less to do with the daring do that he liked to report on in his escapades, and more to do with a policy implemented by General Zachary Taylor, later president. Wasn't president when this happened. But in 1842, General Zachary Taylor announced that the U.S. government would pay for any captives brought into Fort Gibson. To absolutely nobody's surprise, except for maybe, Taylor's and people back then who actually thought, this is a good idea, let's do this. Kidnapping flourished. All right, more people were kidnapped because then they could, get the ransoms back. Apparently they did negotiate with terrorists back then. And in January of 1843, James Parker heard of 2 boys that were brought into Fort Gibson. And when he went to Fort Gibson, he found his nephew and grandson. So yeah, James Pratt Plummer was now 8, so it had been 7 years, and 7 years. And John Richard Parker was now 13. Neither one of them spoke English anymore. Both were returned to their white families. John, who was Cynthia's brother, was later sent to the Comanche to try and convince Cynthia to leave. Their mother Lucy, sent him and said, you need to try and get Cynthia back. His story has been lost to time. We don't actually know what happened to John when he returned to the Comanche. He was fluent in the language, so most likely he would have been able to at least parley with them. Many legends about him exist. All right, Cynthia herself reported that he died of smallpox. We don't know if that's true. Of course, the favored version is that he fell in love with a dark-eyed Indian beauty and stayed married to her. One report has him becoming a farmer in northern Mexico and passing away in 1916. We don't actually know what happened to John Parker. James Pratt Plummer would marry twice before dying on November 17, 1862, of pneumonia while serving in the Confederate Army in Little Rock, Arkansas, which I find particularly fascinating because as the absolute youngest, he would have had zero memory of any of his white kin, right? He was 14 months old when he was kidnapped, so I find it fascinating that he joined the Confederate Army. I can only assume he was well treated by his white family when he was returned, unlike, Cynthia and Parker. So what happened there? They knew she was still alive. There were various reported sightings of her over the years. In April 1846, we had a Colonel Leonard H. Williams, was an Indian agent. He was tasked with contacting the Peninsula chief Pahayuko. I'm going to mispronounce the shit out of this. Pahayuko was one of the peace chiefs, which is exactly what it sounds like. He was pushing for peace between the Comanche and the white people. And when Williams found the village where Pahayuko was living, he also found Cynthia Ann Parker, now age 19, and most famously known as the last of the missing captives. She kind of stood out too. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. It was patently obvious she was not a Native American. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This is where we get the legends of, how well they treated their captives, right? While the older women, Rachel at 17, Elizabeth, whose age we don't know, but she was a mother at the time of the Parker raid, so old enough, were brutalized and tortured for their captivities. For children, it was considerably different. Yes, the Comanche did murder Rachel's 7-week-old daughter because, she was a slave, unable to perform her duties as a slave because she was nursing. And they didn't care about, propagating slavery because they would just sell her, but what would they do with a fucking infant, right? But the sweet spot for children was to be old enough to be useful, which apparently 14-month-old James was, and young enough to be trainable, which is where Cynthia and John fit in. So they fit in that sweet spot of being able to be adopted by the tribe, which they all three were, and all three were raised as Comanche children. By the time Colonel Williams spotted her in 1846, she was going by the name Nata. I'm definitely mispronouncing that one. She had spent 10 years learning how to be a Comanche and was very confused as to why this white colonel was fascinated with her and insisted on speaking with her. She kept running away and hiding from him whenever he tried to approach her. And Williams tried. When she wouldn't approach him, he tried very hard to purchase her from the band. But she was 19, definitely an adult in Comanche standards, able to make her own decision, didn't want to be purchased because she was one of the Comanche, not a slave, and was also the wife of Peta Nocona. So she was decidedly not for sale at this point in time. Having learned that she was still alive in 1847, as the next spotting of her, we had Robert Neighbors took it upon himself to try and rescue Cynthia Ann / Nata. I think the June 1st, 1846 headline of, quote, "Miss Parker has married an Indian chief, offended his delicate sensibilities," so he was determined to rescue her. He also tried to buy her back. Nata and Peta Nocona, recognizing that it was not impossible that other Comanche might be willing to take the trade, moved to a different band of Comanche further west from the frontier to keep her safe, basically, keep her with her husband. Then we have 1851, a trader to the Comanche, Victor Rose, saw Cynthia Ann / Nata in the village and asked her, presumably in Comanche, since by this time she did not speak any English, if she wanted to leave. And she responded by shaking her head and saying, "I am happily married. I love my husband, who is good and kind, and my little ones, who too are his, and I cannot forsake them." Something to that effect. Now, the author of this book, S.C. Gwynne, he's not sure if Cynthia would have spoken such grammatically perfect sentences. If the question was asked and answered in Comanche, it's entirely possible that this is a accurate translation as far as tone and intent goes. So that's what I'm going with, as it was probably a fairly accurate translation with tone and intent. And Victor Rose was more or less happy to leave her be, because he wasn't there to rescue white women. He was there to trade, and she didn't want to be traded. So he's like, all right, cool. Kudos to you, Victor Rose. The last reported sighting of Cynthia Rose was in the late 1850s, when Captain Randolph Marcy, who was an explorer and Western frontier chronicler, reported, quote, "There is at this time a white woman among the Middle Comanches who, with her brother, was captured while they were young children from their father's house in the western part of Texas. This woman has adopted all the habits and peculiarities of the Comanches, has an Indian husband and children, and cannot be persuaded to leave them." End quote. And that was it. She was, at this point, effectively lost to the white man. All right. And Gwynne does a remarkable job tracing Cynthia Ann and Peta Nocona's steps throughout the West, but really there's no way of knowing all the details. All right. We can know how the Comanche lived. We can know that the women did X and the men did Y, but it's really all just guesswork, right? From that last report by Marcy until the Texas Rangers in the Battle of Pease River, when the Rangers were riding down on her and she shouted out, "Americano, Americano," and the Rangers realized that the squaw they were about to shoot had blue eyes, she was lost. But once they realized that, they were like, "She's got blue eyes. This is a white woman." Nata was taken, along with her daughter Prairie Flower, and was basically held captive among the whites until her death in 1870. So she spent the last 10 years of her life in true captivity. She very much considered herself a Comanche, did not consider the Comanche her captives. They were her family, but the white people were definitely her captives. She tried multiple times to escape and get back to the Comancheria. Each time she was corralled and dragged back. At least until 1864, that was when her daughter Prairie Flower died of influenza. And Cynthia Ann, realizing that she would never be allowed to return home, and having lost her only anchor, being her daughter, slowly starved herself to death over the next 6 years, which is absolutely heartbreaking. The life she'd lived and the freedom that she'd had and known, and it was taken away from her because, it was for her own good. Isn't that always the way? But the reports above all mention children, right? Meaning more than one. So Cynthia Ann had 3 children with Peta Nocona. Peta also died at the Battle of Pease River, but their 2 sons, Quanah and Peanuts, survived, which suggests some remnant of memory from her childhood pre-Comanche, because Quanah reported that the reason his younger brother was named Peanuts is that Nata had a fond childhood memory of eating peanuts around the fireside at Parker's Fort. Most likely that's the only place the memory could have come from. They were hardly something that were wildly eaten and traded among the Comanche. Now, following the Battle of Pease River, Quanah and Peanuts made their way to the closest Comanche band they could find, where they were basically treated as poor relations come begging, which they were, all right? Quanah was about 12 years old. Peanuts was 1 or 2 years younger than him, so call it 10. And from there, they had to figure it out on their own, all right? Because men of the Comanche hunted and made war. The women did the butchering, cooking, tanning, leather making of teepees and clothing, packing and unpacking when the tribe moved. The men made war. And if he couldn't figure out how to hunt for himself and cook it himself, then he was going to starve to death. And so he figured it out. Quanah pulled it off, and no joke that this, like the next part where he's describing Quanah's adventures, reads a whole lot like a classic hero's arc. I'm not even joking about that, right? The tragedy occurs, his childhood is taken away from him, his mother and younger sister are kidnapped, his father is dead. And from there, his life takes this interesting trajectory that is just all about adventure and tragedy, and ends with the brutal acknowledgement of reality and finding his way in the new world, which is, of course, the white man's world. Quanah would eventually rise up to become the last of the Comanche chiefs to accept conditions as they were and move to the reservation. Right? His was the last band that was tracked down and convinced to move, and he did it, and he absolutely kept his word. Once he agreed to it, he didn't break his word on that. He said, my people are going to the reservation, and he did the best he could to negotiate good deals for his people, but it was over at that point. This was 1870 something, a couple of years after his mother died, is when that happened. But how do we get from the Comanche being the acknowledged dominant military presence of the Great American Plains to living on skint reservations under a white man's privilege? Well, it said 50 brutal years of warfare, right? And it was violent, bloody warfare. This was not just the typically retold story of white man came and steamrolled the native tribes. The Comanche were brutal. It's not just the kidnapping and rape of white women, right? There's a reason the Apache were happy to work as scouts when hunting Comanche. The Comanche didn't just brutalize and torture white women. Anyone who was not Comanche could be thus taken and treated. Right? Anyone who fell into their hands was subject to the same. Torture included gang rape, beatings, slow roasting somebody over a spit. That's not a Hollywood fiction. They would literally roast somebody on a spit over an open fire just to hear them scream. Just for shits and giggles. Slowly burning someone's nose off of their face. There's at least one report of one of the women who was purchased back for the Comanche who literally had no nose because they burned it off her face with fire. They put it up and just sizzle away her nose until she had this open gaping cavity. Scalping was done by both sides. You can't really say scalping because the white man did it too. That was both. Both sides did that one. Still brutal, right? He talks about, one time they rode up and took a pregnant woman and her husband and shot her full of arrows, including the baby, and then scalped her alive. She managed to survive that, but died obviously of infection like several days later because the baby died in her belly. And just, yeah. The Comanche were not one of the 5 civilized tribes that Washington, D.C. had been romanticizing ever since Jean-Jacques Rousseau had written his pablum contextualizing the noble savage. That is what D.C. had been operating under. And it didn't help that when, of course, Plymouth Rock was founded and everything else, they met the 5 civilized tribes who were farmers all to some extent. And not a whole lot of noble, just a whole lot of savagery. And Gwynne highlights this point again and again and again. He's bringing back to earth a lot of the romanticization of how tragic the tribes were, saying, no, they actually did fight back, and the Comanche gave as good as they got. And it was military might that turned it around. Courtesy of Samuel Colt. How so? Well, if you want to know a bit more about that specifically, check out Gun Barons, which I read last year. All right, the first revolver was a riff on muzzle loaders. They hadn't yet figured out breech loading and the actual standalone cartridges, but it did allow the gunman to fire 7 shots before needing to reload. And unlike the book I read last month, Cult of Glory, right, about the Rangers, Gwynne highlights exactly why the Texas Rangers were such utter badasses at this point in time. Namely starting with John Coffey Hayes, who drilled his Rangers on mounted battle tactics. See, Hayes recognized the Comanches' effectiveness was largely due to their mobility, and knew that dismounting was a tactical disadvantage in battle against mounted combat troops. So he drilled his Rangers, first with the single-shot pistols because that was what was available, until they could hit a small target at a gallop. And then sometimes in 1843, Hayes Lieutenant Samuel Walker discovered the Colt revolver, which effectively saved a design that was destined for the scrap heap of history and changed the course of that history on the frontier. Because now, each Ranger would carry 4 revolvers, which were 7 shots each, changing out an empty revolver for a fully loaded one. And they were capable of hitting and firing, that means up to 28 targets in less than a minute. At a full gallop. Which is absolutely terrifying to the Comanche, who are used to being the predominant mounted combat troops. And suddenly, somebody who can fire even faster than they could with the arrows were riding down on them. And the Comanche based battle success on who had the most magic, meaning the spirits were on their side. And watching a Comanche chief fall in battle was seen as an ill omen, and the Comanche would flee. He actually gives a very poignant description of why, like, the ultimate tragedy of Cynthia Ann was she went from living in a world where magic was real, right, and nature and the spirit speak to you, to being confined in a house, being trapped in a corset and wearing a dress, and not able to speak to the people around her because she didn't remember English, and having her world turned upside down and removed from the magic of the world around her. And it was a very poignant section. It's like, yeah, that would fucking suck, man. Gwynne does a remarkable job highlighting the different battle tactics, pointing out, matter of factly, there's no judgment here. He's not trying to say white man won because they were better. He's just pointing out matter of fact, all right? Part of the white man's success on the frontier was their willingness to charge into oncoming fire to take a position. All right? Comanche didn't do that. All right? If they would not do that. It's a tactical disadvantage to be that willing to retreat. There's some value to it, don't get me wrong. Retreating, not making a forlorn hope charge is not necessarily a bad thing unless retreat is your constant, because then they got nothing against shooting you in the back, man. And it's just willpower is what it came down to, right? The U.S. Army had the willpower to steamroll over them, which was more willpower than the Comanche had to stand and fight. Which is not to say they were cowards. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it was different battle tactics, and clearly the U.S. military won that round. So 50 years of warfare on both sides, doing everything they could to demolish the other and demoralize them. And Gwynne spells out how the frontier shifted forward and back over this 50 years depending on what was going on in the East. So when the Civil War happened, the frontier shrank exponentially because there was nobody available to fight the Comanche. They were all back east fighting the Civil War. And then when it all came down, the Comanche area shrunk, which used to stretch again from Wyoming to northern Mexico, an acreage of over 200 million acres, was shrunk down to 2 million. So they had a 99% reduction in land mass. And that was set aside for the Comanche, initially. And didn't last because it never did, right? Ultimately, the reservation would be shrunk even more to 160 acres per head, which by this time the tribe had shrunk to about 3,000 members, so less than 500,000 acres. I think it's like 480, something like that. But Quanah, historically proving what a remarkable person he was, rode those winds of change, all right? Having determined that there was no point in continuing to fight because the army would just roll in and kill all of them, he talked his people into conceding and going to the reservation. And then once he was there, once he made that move, he did everything he could to ensure that his people were taken care of. Starting with capitalism, shocked the shit out of me, but I loved it. Loved it. That's the way to win, man. Right? No joke. He doesn't call it capitalism in the book, but that's what it is. He recognized that the reservation, the 2 million acres initially that they were given, represented some of the most outstanding grazing lands available. And of course, there were no buffalo left to graze those lands because the buffalo had already been slaughtered wholesale. So he leased the land to the cattle barons at like $1,000 per year per lease or something like that, which was an enormous sum of money back then. And that lasted all the way up until the Dawes Act. It was the Dawes Act that opened up Oklahoma for the Sooners. The Sooners were the ones who jumped the barrier. That was the whole Far and Away movie thing. That was what that was about. But yeah, he leased the land back to the cattle barons and made money on it. Yeah, he even refused to become a farmer. He started his own herd of cattle, which he didn't sell back to D.C. He kept it for his people so that his people could be fed. He became an advocate for his people in D.C. He traveled frequently back there, and actually Theodore Roosevelt went and stayed at Quanah's house on the reservation, which was the Star House. It was like a 10-room mansion that he managed to talk other people into building for him. Gotta love him. Capitalism. You make other people do the work for you and let them pay you for the privilege of doing it. You gotta love it. So Teddy Roosevelt came and stayed at his place for a while, and everything he amassed, he gave back to his people. When he actually died on February 23rd, 1911, he only had like $100 in his bank account. He even managed to befriend Colonel Ronald Slidell Mackenzie, who was like the anti-Custer in that he was not flashy and actually competent, which means I had literally never heard of him prior to reading this book because he was actually good at his job, so history has largely forgotten him. Quanah so impressed Mackenzie that Mackenzie went out of his way to find out what had happened to Nutta and Prairie Flower for Quanah, and said, "I'm sorry to inform you, your mother and younger sister perished. These are the dates of their death." Quanah even managed to get I think it was Texas state legislature to pay to move Nutta's body to the Oklahoma reservations so that she could be buried next to Quanah when he passed. And later, Texas also moved Prairie Flower. So the three of them are buried together. Of course, Peanuts died decades prior to that. He died as a young man. I don't remember how, although it is in the book. And of course, Peter Nakona perished at Peace River. Quanah, again, once he gave his word was his bond. And he kept his people out of the ghost dance. So when that movement spread, he kept them out of it, so they were not at Wounded Knee, which is the subject of next week's book. And he helped found the Native American Church, which is the subject of the last book of this month. So he ties together a lot of strings from the Old West. This book was outstanding. And it reads like a novel of the Wild West. It makes it a very fast read. I tore through this, and includes history I didn't know, and perspective that, the white guilt proponents don't want you to think about. Okay, history is never black and white. It never is. Remember when I read the book on Genghis Khan several years ago, and everybody's like, oh, he was this mass slaughterer. Well, from that perspective, yes, but from the perspective of the Mongolians, he did great things for them, right? He lifted the Mongolians up from being small nomadic steppe tribe to a massive military power. Quanah was very much the same. He kept his people whole as well as he could, body and soul, in very trying times. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.